Introduction to Algebra, Part 8, Graphing. At the end of this lesson, you will understand the importance of graphing equations, describe the purpose of the x and y axis, and you'll be able to graph simple equations. So we've been looking at a lot of equations, and what we remember is sometimes equations have more than one solution. So take the equation y equals 5x plus 7. Well, if x is 1, y is 5 plus 7 or 12. If x is 2, then y is 5 times 2, which is 10, plus 7, which is 17. Or if x is 3, it's 3 times 5, which is 15, plus 7 is 22. And then if x is 4, it's 5 times 4, which is 20, plus 7 is 27. So while that table worked fine to show us for various values of x what y is, sometimes we want to have a visual representation of it, and this is where a graph comes in. So you see here, we've taken that information, y equals 5x plus 7, and we put it on a graph. And you see here on the horizontal line we have the value of x, and on the vertical line we have the letter value y. So I can look along the x line and say, okay, for the value of x equals, say, 1, what is the value of y? And this is how graphing works. So at the beginning, when we talk about graphing, we want to understand the concept of axes. Axes are basically represent the two variables, x and y. So you'll see here with this graph, we've got an x-axis, which is where the values of x are going to be kind of tracked, and y, where the values of y are going to be tracked. So once we've created an x and y axis on your graphing paper, the next thing you do is you're going to plot the points for each value of x. So we can simply go through and say, okay, if x is 0, what is y, and put that on, and where x is 1, what is the value of y, and for x is 2, what is the value of y, and then we can plot them on the graph. Now, we can just go through and plot all the individual points, but sometimes that gets to be pretty complicated. So there's actually a way we can generate a graph simply by calculating a few specific points. And the first set of points we want to calculate are what are called the intercepts, or where x is 0 and y is 0. So take that equation 5x plus 7. Well, we know that when x is 0, y equals 7. So that we know when we're crossing the point where x is 0, we're going to set y to 7. Then we calculate for where y equals 0, and in this case it's a little complicated. It's about -7/5. So we've calculated the intercepts where x is 0 and y is 0. Now there's one other thing we can calculate, which is called the slope. Now the slope is how fast y is increasing every time we increase x. Think of it as how steep the line is, or how steep that road is. So if we go back to our original equation, when x is 0, y is 7, and when x is 1, y is 12. So the difference between, we went from 0 to 1 on x, so that's 1, and we increased 5 from y, so we went from 7 to 12. Now when x went from 1 to 2, well, it's now y is 17, so the slope stayed at y. So we know that the slope of y equals 5x plus 7 is 5. And by the way, if you hadn't figured this out, you see how it's 5x? Whenever you see equations where there aren't exponents, if you see simply 5x, you're going to know that the slope is y. So there's one other thing we want to think about when we're graphing. It's something called scale, because sometimes when we're dealing with large or small values on graphs, those little ticks on the graph have to have different values. Now you can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or you can do 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, or you could do 10, 20, 30, 40, 60. Now what your scale is going to be is going to be dependent upon the graph and how steep it is and how big the values are. And you see here we've got a couple of examples of different scales. Now the reason why this is important is when you start to look at the answers later on in the lesson, be aware that if you ran a slightly different scale than what I used for the answers, your graph may look slightly different. But what you're really interested in is, are the intercepts the same, where it crosses the x-axis and the y-axis, and does that slope, how steep the curve is, look the same? So when we calculate the slopes and the intercepts and the slopes, we can now use this information to graph it. The intercepts are going to tell you where the line is going to cross that x and y axis, and the slope is going to tell you how steep the line is. So let's go ahead and do some questions. Now, you're going to want to pause after this slide and do the questions because there are a couple more pages. So the first one is graph the following equations. Y equals x. Then do the graph y equals negative x. Now do the equation, graph it, of y equals 2x plus 7. And the last one, y equals negative 3x plus 4. And remember, with all of these, calculate the intercepts and also calculate the slope. Okay, so now let's do something a little more complicated. Let's take the equation y equals 7x minus 14. So what is the value of x for the value y equals 0? This is going to be called the y-intercept. When y is 0, what is x? Now, what is the value of y when x equals 0? This is called the x-intercept. Then, what is the slope of the equation? And then ultimately graph the equation y equals 7x. Okay, so let's take a look at our answers. Now remember, depending upon your scale, these may look slightly differently. You're really interested in the intercepts and that slope and how steep the curve is. First one, y equals x. See, you got a nice, for every value that x increases, y increases 1. And then we have y equals negative x. Now notice on this one, every time we increase x, y goes down by 1. Okay, so now let's take a look at a little bit more complicated ones. Y equals 2x plus 7. Well, we know when x is 0, that y is 7. And we also know that when y is 0, x is negative 7. So you see here, this one is shifted a little bit to the left, and because the slope is 2, the curve's much steeper. Now in the second one, we said y equals negative 3x plus 4. So when x is 0, y is 4. You can see that there. And when y is 0, x is, what is it? When y is 0, x is, it's actually 3/4. There you go. Okay, so now let's do the more complicated one, y equals 7x minus 14. Now remember, we want slopes and intercepts. So when y is 0, x is 2. And then we want the x-intercept when x is 0, y is negative 14. So you see here, we've got 2 points we can graph. X is 2, y is 0, and x is 0, y is negative 14. And we know if we actually write out a table, the slope is 7. And then we can graph the equation y equals 7x minus 14. Okay, so now we're going to graph the equation y equals 7x minus 4. And so we know when x is 0, y is 7. And we got that on the graph. And then we know when y is 0, x is negative 14, and we have that on the graph. And with just those 2 points, we can draw a line, and you see here, here's the equation, y equals 7x minus 14. I hope you enjoyed this video.